you all. I want to stress two caveats at the beginning of this. First of all, this was my first COP, so I don't have personal prior knowledge of how past COPs worked, but I have always taken an interest from afar, so I have some idea there. But secondly, COP is so complex, so many people over 14 days doing so many different things that there were things I experienced directly, which was only a very small subset. And then there were some things I heard about that I had some knowledge about. And then I think by far the larger proportion of things I never heard about. So I want to make it clear that I don't have some omnipresent, omniscient view of what went on at COP. But I will just say that it was a totally extraordinary experience. It was absolutely a hui of humanity in terms of almost every country represented there, but crucially a very great diversity of people in each country. So it's not just political leaders of various kinds, or indeed civil servants working in governments, but it's a large range of civil society representatives there as well. So in our New Zealand delegation, there were the political and civil service members, but then there were also civil society members as well. And I think that's a really important part about COP, because it makes it very different from other international organizations, with the exception of a lot of work that goes on in the UN. But when you get to the General Assembly of the UN, that becomes, I think, rather more narrowly focused. So that's why COP is so fascinating. Going into this one, there was a very big worldwide interfaith preparations from all sorts of different alliances and indeed individual faiths and religions. And Interfaith Scotland, as based in Glasgow, played a very important role, amongst others, as being a host and coordinator for that. I will start almost a month before COP in terms of St. Francis Day, October the 4th, when at the Vatican, Pope Francis gathered more than 40 religious leaders, pretty much, I think, every faith represented from around the world. And they did produce a very powerful document setting the climate crisis and its co-crises. So we've got climate breakdown as one crisis and ecosystem collapse as the other. And these co-crises are interdependent on each other. The cause of one causes the other, and solutions to one can help solve the other. So it's very much about that sense of care of creation in this. So it was a very splendid document, articulating very well various social justice and environmental justice issues. But in many ways, it read like the sort of declaration from a much wider range of organizations. And I noted that the word, in that whole document, the word spirit was only used once, and the word spiritual was only used once too. And I have a strong personal view that the more that we can bring that core element of our faith into this work, the more effective we can be, because that, amongst other ways, is how we can be very distinctive and make an important and different contribution than other civil society groups might be able to do. The COP itself started on Sunday, the 31st of October. Not much happened formally. It was just a formal opening. But that first day of COP in George Square in Glasgow, the largest of the city's squares, there was a very big interfaith vigil and interfaith declaration handed out over that. And there were some very wonderful expressions from, briefly, from each of the faiths represented. And so, for example, as in a sense, partly host, because Bishop Mark Strange is from the Episcopal Church in Scotland, said that we are all here to be activists and to push the point about climate and how it affects us. But we all need to reflect on the role that we can play in our faiths to do more in that work. After the vigil in the square, there was then a shift away. Oh, I'll add one other thing about the square. There were about 10,000 people watching online from around the world. So it was live streamed. And there was a group of 500 or so in the square itself. The numbers were contained for practical reasons. And so that was a pretty good online live stream from around the world. But from there, people moved on to the Garton Hill Synagogue in Glasgow, where there was a Talanoa dialogue and worship there. And the number of people there, in person and online, was about 200. And I wasn't able to go to that because I had to go back to other COP things. But I've heard wonderful things from that. And it was, I found quite fascinating that it was very explicitly this specific approach to dialogue at Talanoa that was adopted for the discussion there. So clearly there is this important role that faith and religion plays in societies around the world that obviously varies from country to country by the nature of the culture and history and everything else of those countries. And that is very much reflected in COP2, because as I said, there's this very, very strong civil society representation there that brings values of all sorts far more strongly into the debate than we might find elsewhere. And so it was very good to see this interfaith activity playing its role at COP26. This is just, I'm just going to give you one example of what interfaith organizations put on the table. More than 100 interfaith leaders and dozens of faith-based organizations put to the climate summit a plant-based treaty, so a call to encourage the adoption of vegan and plant-based diets worldwide as a companion to the Paris Agreement on climate. And very important, because the way currently we do farm, the way we do produce food, is in aggregate the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Because it's the way we change land use to farm, it's the way we farm, and obviously animals with a very large methane component, ruminant animals, contributing to those emissions. But it's across all of agriculture. So, for example, rice paddies are also a prodigious producer of methane. So it's not just ruminant animals. So there's this huge need to transform the global farming system and food system. And this is what this declaration, which was put together by, was led by the Israel Climate Save organization, and amongst the leaders who were delivering it was a former chief rabbi of Ireland, Rabbi David Rosen. And that was just sort of one example of how issues are put on the table. By way of reflection of what happens afterwards, this is obviously incredibly important ongoing work. And I can't stress enough my sort of personal view on this, that we have an important role here in the spirit, if you like, because when we look at these huge complexities of these co-crises, I'm not at all sure we will do enough until we care enough about the living earth, about creation or nature, however we want to phrase that. And we probably won't care enough until we rediscover and rebuild our spiritual relationship. And here in New Zealand, I think we're incredibly fortunate in the way to our Māori, a Māori worldview in which we humans are just an integral part of that web of life. The role we play in it, the responsibilities we have, the dependency we have on that web of life, I think is very exciting to see that gaining wider appreciation and understanding here in New Zealand. For example, I was just earlier today on a Zoom call about a food system transformation here in New Zealand, and there was a very big emphasis, and these are sort of mainstream food and agricultural organizations, emphasizing that te ao Māori. So I think here in New Zealand, we are moving in an interesting and beneficial way on that. And just one last reflection, there is an organization that is called Faith for Earth Initiative, and that's inside the United Nations Environment Programme. 10 years ago, they published a book entitled Earth and Faith, a book of reflection for action. And then last year, prior to COP, they produced another book, Faith for Earth, a call for action, rather than just a reflection for action. And what the contrast between the two books, what represented, I think, the growing sense of a role that faith plays in all this, but absolutely a growing sense of acute awareness of how these co-crises are continuing to escalate, and therefore how urgent this all is. So I think a really interesting juxtaposition for reflection from action to a call for action. Clearly we need to go one step further, which is action itself. And therefore, of course, as some of you know, there's various ways I think that I've been exploring with others about how our churches, our faith organizations can be very actively involved in practicing change, demonstrating change, pushing for change, so that we learn how to live in far greater sort of symbiosis with all of creation, with all of nature. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you.